my lovely students, how are you all? A very hearty welcome to this mind-blowing platform, Physics Wallah. My name is Nupur Sharma and today we are going to do an interesting chapter, a triumph of surgery. But bachas, before starting the chapter, we'll talk about some people who own pets. Yes, people love their pets unconditionally. They love their pets so much that sometimes they love them like their own children. Yes, they consider them to be an important part of their family. You know, you can understand this if you own a pet or you have seen someone who owns a pet. In this chapter also, we are going to talk about a lady who loves her pet so much so that she spoils her pet like her own child. Okay, now let's start with the title, A Triumph of Surgery. Now, what do you mean by triumph? Triumph means success, okay, and success of surgery. Now, when we hear surgery, what do we think about? Surgery means operation. So, in this chapter, we are going to learn that whether this doctor is going to operate this dog or which surgery is he talking about. So, now let's move on to the chapter. Now, we are going to do an overview of the chapter, then line by line explanation, then summary, and in the end, we'll discuss the question answers. A Triumph of Surgery is a story written by James Alfred Witt. He was popularly known as James Herriot and he was British veterinary surgeon and a writer too. Now, this chapter was written by a surgeon himself. Yes, who was a surgeon? He was a veterinary surgeon. Okay, and his name was James Alfred Witt and he was called, his pen name was James Herriot. You know what's a pen name? Pen name is usually used by a person. Okay, whenever he writes something, below he writes his pen name. He doesn't write his full name, but he uses his pen name. Now, he was a British veterinary surgeon and he was a writer too. So, what does he write about? He wrote about his own, the patients that used to come to him. And he used to even write about the people who used to own those patients. It means he used to write about the bond that the pet and their owners, they share the bond. That bond he used to write about. In this story also, he, talks about one of his patients and his owner. He wrote about Mrs. Pumphrey. Mrs. Pumphrey is a rich and emotional lady who had a cute dog, Tricki. She loved him so much that she always overfed him. So, we've come across the, second character of the story, that is Mrs. Pumphrey. She was a rich and emotional lady who loved her dog so much and the dog, his name was Tricki. She loved him so much that she always overfed him. She used to feed him a lot. Therefore, Tricki had put on a lot of weight. Now we can see that Tricki had become very fat and hence became lethargic. Lethargic means he could not do anything, he always felt tired. When Dr. Herriot saw the fat dog, he was shocked. When Dr. Herriot, who is Dr. Herriot? Dr. Herriot is James Herriot, the writer of the story. When he saw the fat dog for the first time, he was completely shocked. Yes, we'll come to know about James Herriot, that James Herriot was a very, compassionate person who was quite passionate towards his patients. He loved his patients so much that he used to get worried for them. Now we are going to learn why. I was really worried about Tricki this time. I had pulled up my car when I saw him in the street with his mistress and I was shocked at his appearance. Now we can see there is a scene where James Herriot was driving a car and when he saw Tricki, he pulled up his car. He stopped his car and he saw him in the street with his mistress. With his mistress means his master. Okay, and the master was Mrs. Pumphrey. He was very shocked. Dr. Herriot was very much shocked to see the appearance of Tricki, that how Tricki had become. He had become hugely fat. Yes, Tricki had become so so fat, like a bloated sausage with a leg at each corner. Yes, he had become like a bloated sausage. Do you know what a sausage is? Sausage is finely minced meat stuffed into a long cylindrical cases and divided into small lengths by twisting or tying. Usually we do not get to see, sausages in India. Sausages are mainly consumed in foreign countries where the consumption of meat is quite high. And sausage, something, it looks like this. You can see sausage, it's of pinkish color. Okay, it is of meatish appearance, and you can see it in movies. You must have seen it in movies. So he has become like a bloated sausage, a filled up sausage, okay, a bloated up sausage with leg at each corner. It was appearing that he was like a bloated sausage. It's just a lean sausage. We can make a bloated sausage as well. He was like this, yes. And each of his leg was, moving out like this. His eyes, bloodshot and rheumy, stared straight ahead, and his tongue lolled from his jaws. Now his eyes, he's explaining that how he looked. His eyes were bloodshot. They were filled with blood and rheumy. Rheumy means they were filled with, watery liquid. And his, he was staring ahead, and his tongue was also, moving out, and his tongue was, hanging from his jaws. So he's trying to explain the appearance of the dog. Now, generally, when a pet becomes very sick, when a dog becomes very sick, his eyes start filling up with, this water, this mucus type liquid it starts filling with. Now, rheumy, a watery discharge from a mucous membrane, especially from the corner of the eyes. It appears, mucus comes out from the nose and eyes. So we can see that he was quite ill. Tricki was quite ill. Now in this chapter, I want to say something again, that we are using he instead of it for Tricki. Yes, we are using he instead of it for Tricki, because Tricki is loved so much by Mrs. Pumphrey that we are not objectifying him, we are not using it for it, but we are using he. Sometimes when the pet is too close to you, when the animal is too close, we can also use he instead of it. So in that case, in this case, we are going to use him for Tricki. Mrs. Pumphrey hastened to explain. He was so listless, Mr. Herriot. He seemed to have no energy. Now, Mrs. Pumphrey is trying to explain. She is hastening. She is, saying, she's trying to explain that he was so listless. He was so listless means he was not doing anything. He was just sitting idle. And Mr. Herriot, he seemed to have no energy. He was lacking energy. He didn't have any energy at all. Okay. I thought he must be suffering from malnutrition, so I have been giving him some little extras between meals to build him up, some malt and cod liver oil and a bowl of Horlicks at night to make him sleep. Nothing much really. Now Mrs. Pumphrey is trying to explain Dr. Herriot that why is he so. So she is explaining that I thought that the dog was malnutrition because he's not having any energy, and Mrs. Pumphrey thought that food gives us energy. That is why she started overfeeding the dog. What did she used to give him? She used to give him malt. Okay, malt is water of jowar water she used to give him, and cod liver oil. Yeah, cod liver oil is a type of oil from fishes. Okay, and a bowl of Horlicks. And a bowl of Horlicks at night. And that was not it. It was given between meals. Yeah, she used to even give him meals, breakfast, lunch and dinner. Additionally, she used to give him this thing and nothing much really. And even after giving him so much, she used to say, nothing much really. I didn't give him much, And did you cut down on the sweet things as I told you? Now, he asked, did you cut down on the sweet things? Because you know that whenever a person becomes fat, he is being told that you do not have to consume sweet things because sweet things increase your calories. Oh, I did for a bit, but he seemed to be so weak, I had to relent. She said, okay, I did for a bit, but I couldn't help myself because I love him so much and he loves sweet so much. I had to relent. He was so weak, he was so weak. I had to relent. I had to give up. Yeah, relent means she had to give up. He does love cream cakes and chocolate, so he loves cream cakes and chocolate so much. I couldn't control myself. I can't bear to refuse him. I can't bear to refuse him. She couldn't say no to her dog. I looked down again at the little dog. That was the trouble. Tricky's only fault was greed. I looked down again. Now, he looked down again. Dr. Herriot looked down at Tricki again and at that little dog. He was in a very pathetic condition. He was in trouble, and Tricky's only fault was greed. Now we can see that Tricki was in a pathetic condition, and we can make it out that Mrs. Pumphrey was the one responsible for his condition. We can see that she was overfeeding him. She was giving him malt. She was giving him cod liver oil. She was giving him sweets. All the things are full of calories, and if you really feel that if a person is feeling low and you feed him extra calories and he's going to work, no, that's not the case. And Dr. Herriot understood that. He knew that Tricky's only fault was greed. Yeah, Tricki was a very greedy dog. He had never been known to refuse food. He would tackle a meal at any hour of the day or night. And I wondered about all the things Mrs. Pumphrey hadn't mentioned. Now, Dr. Herriot, he is thinking that, you know, Tricki has never refused food in his life. Tricki was so greedy that he could tackle a meat. He could eat a meal any time of the day, Even if you wake up at midnight and you offer him something, he's going to eat it. He's not going to refuse food. And I wondered about all the things, and he was wondering what Mrs. Pumphrey hadn't told him. He was thinking that Mrs. Pumphrey might be giving him something else too. She told about malt, she told about the cod liver oil, but she didn't tell him a lot of things. He knew, he was actually sure of it. Are you giving him plenty of exercise? Then the question came up, are you giving him plenty of exercise? Obviously, the dog was so fat, he needed a lot of exercises. Well, he has his little walks with me, as you can see. But Hodkin, the gardener, has been down with lumbago, so there has been no ring throwing lately. Then she explains that yes, he has little walks, as you can see, that she was also out for a walk with Tricki. So she said that yes, we are going for a walk. But yes, Hodkin, the gardener who used to play with Tricki, was down with lumbago. He was suffering from lumbago. Lumbago means the muscular pain in the lower part of the back. So he was suffering from some kind of pain, the gardener. So there was no ring throwing lately. You know, the dogs love the ring throwing. You throw something and they play fetch. You know, ring throwing means he loved to play fetch, but it was not happening because of Hodkin was down with lumbago. So here we can see that he was not even getting enough exercises. And now what happens? I tried to sound severe. Now I really mean this. If you don't cut his food right down and give him some more exercise, he is going to be really ill. You must harden your heart and keep him on a very strict diet. Now what happens? He is trying to sound very severe. He is trying to sound very serious because he actually means it. He tells Mrs. Pumphrey that now if you really don't cut on his food, if you don't stop giving him food, and if you don't give him, you know, much of the exercises which I have already told you, you have to harden your heart. You have to be strong, Mrs. Pumphrey, okay? You have to be strong, and you have to keep him on a very strict diet. Now, Dr. Herriot knew that Mrs. Pumphrey loved the dog so much. She couldn't refuse food to him. So he told her that you have to, you know, harden your heart. You don't have to be so lovey-dovey with Tricki. You don't have to, you know, melt your heart. Your heart shouldn't melt every time, you know, Tricki asks for food. So you have to be very strict with him. Mrs. Pumphrey wrung her hands. Oh, I will, Mr. Herriot. Mrs. Pumphrey wrung her hands like this. Okay, what can I do? Because she was feeling, you know, she was not in her own, you know, command. Her emotions were controlling her. She couldn't control her emotions. Her emotions were controlling her instead. I am sure you are right, but it is so difficult, so very difficult. She said, you're right, you're absolutely right, but it's very difficult. She set off, head down along the road as if determined to put the new regime into practice immediately. Now what happened? Mr. Herriot told Mrs. Pumphrey that you have to harden your heart. Yes, but she said that it's very difficult because I love Tricki so much. I can't refuse him. You know, I love Tricki so much. Sometimes when we love the other person so much, other person, or in this case, the animal, we love them so much that we cannot refuse anything to the particular person or animal. And in this case, we can see that Mrs. Pumphrey was not a determined lady. And she always used to, you know, overfeed him. And she set off, but this time she set off. She went, and her head was down along the road. And she was determined. This time, she seemed to be so determined. Yes, now I'm going to, you know, practice this regime, this new regime. I am going to, you know, cut down on the food. I'm not going to give him the sweets. And I am going to make him do a lot of exercises. This is what Dr. Herriot thought. Okay, but what happened really? Now, I watched their progress with growing concern. Tricki was tottering along in his little tweed coat. He had a whole wardrobe of these coats for the cold weather and the raincoat for the wet days. Now, he was watching their progress with growing concern because as they were walking, as they were passing by, he saw them and he was seeing that Tricki was tottering. Tottering means he was walking with a lot of difficulty in his little tweed coat. Yes, Tricki was wearing a tweed coat. Tweed coat is a coat which is worn, a woolen coat which is worn in the cold weather, and a raincoat. He also had a raincoat, and he had a whole wardrobe of these coats. Okay, so we can really see that Mrs. Pumphrey was considering, this pet like his own child. Like we give, we take care of our child's comfort, that he shouldn't feel cold, he shouldn't feel wet. He also had a lot of raincoats and the tweed coats. He struggled on, drooping in his harness. I thought it wouldn't be long before I heard from Mrs. Pumphrey. Now he said that he was struggling. He was not able to walk properly, and he was drooping. Drooping means he was not able to actually hold his head together. He was not able to hold his head together in the harness. The harness is the, it's kind of a rope which is put around the neck of the pet to pull him. And he thought that, yes, he thought that it wouldn't be long before I heard from Mrs. Pumphrey. He was actually very sure that he's going to hear from Mrs. Pumphrey very soon, because he was a doctor. Actually, he estimated when he saw the condition of Tricki, he was pretty sure that he was going to get a call from Mrs. Pumphrey, because his condition was actually very pathetic. He was not even able to walk properly. He was not able to, hold his head up. Now, the expected call came within a few days. Mrs. Pumphrey was distraught. Now, the call was being expected by Dr. Herriot, and he actually got a call from Mrs. Pumphrey, and she was distraught. Distraught means she was extremely worried. She was not, able to control her, she was very worrisome for her dog. Tricki would eat nothing, refused even his favorite dishes, and besides, he had bouts of vomiting. He spent all his time lying on a rug, panting, didn't want to go for walks, didn't want to do anything. Now, Tricki would eat nothing. As we already know that Tricki never refused food. Okay, now he was refusing food, even his favorite dishes. It means he loved cream cakes and chocolate so much. He was also not eating those things, and plus he was having bouts of vomiting. He was, he was doing a lot of vomit, and he was spending his time lying on a rug. Lying on a rug, he was always lying down, and he was always panting, like, taking long breaths. Didn't want to go for a walk. He was not going for a walk. He was not ready to do anything. We know that he was known not to refuse food, but he was refusing food when we do not feel well. Even with ourselves, we think. But when we don't feel well, we do not want to eat anything. Okay, we are not happy to eat anything. We don't feel like eating anything. And the same thing was happening with Tricki, because he was so sick. He couldn't eat anything. Instead, he was, puking out everything that he used to eat. And he was always lying down. He was not feeling well. And he was always, panting like the dogs do. Okay, you see when the dogs are not feeling well, they just put their tongue out and they're panting like this. Okay. I had made my plans in advance. The only way was to get Tricki out of the house for a period. I suggested that he be hospitalized for about a fortnight to be kept under observation. Now, our Dr. Herriot was already prepared. Yes, because he was such a lovely doctor. He was already prepared. He was already prepared for the call. He knew what he had to do. He had to take Tricki out of the house for a period. He knew that Mrs. Pumphrey, she is going to pamper him. Okay, Mrs. Pumphrey cannot control the situation, so he has to get him out. I suggested that he be hospitalized for about a fortnight. Fortnight means 2 weeks. A period of 2 weeks is called a fortnight, to be kept under observation. He had to be kept under observation. This is what he told Mrs. Pumphrey. The poor lady almost swooned. She was sure he would pine and die if he did not see her every day. Poor lady almost swooned. Swoon means she was, doing like this. She was actually, she couldn't faint. She could faint on hearing this, she could faint because she loved Tricki so much. She couldn't live without him, and she was pretty sure that Tricki would also pine and die. He would also die without her. If he would not see her every day, he would die. Actually, Mrs. Pumphrey would die if she wouldn't see Tricki, because she loved him so much and she thought that our love, our bond is so close, our bond is so, strong that we cannot live without each other. Now what happened? But I took a firm line. Tricki was very ill and this was the only way to save him. In fact, I thought it is best to take him without delay, and followed by Mrs. Pumphrey's wailing, I marched out to the car carrying the little dog wrapped in a blanket. Now what happened? He took a firm line. He was very serious this time. Tricki was very ill and this was the only way to save him. He knew that this is the only way that he could be saved, and he thought that it's better if he takes Tricki out of the house as early as possible without any delay. And he followed by Mrs. Pumphrey's wailing. Mrs. Pumphrey was crying. She was crying so much. I marched out to the car. He marched out of the car and he wrapped Tricki, in the blanket, because he knew that if he would stay for a little longer, Mrs. Pumphrey would give up. Mrs. Pumphrey won't be able to send Tricki, and she cannot actually bear, him going so far from her. So that is why he just thought of running away with Tricki. The entire staff was roused and maids rushed in and out, bringing his day bed, his night bed, favorite cushions, toys and rubber rings, breakfast bowl, lunch bowl, supper bowl. Oh my God. The entire staff was now busy packing things of Tricki. Tricki was such a pampered dog. He had so many luxuries around him, and all the luxuries were, ready to be carried along with him. All his day bed, his night bed. Even we don't have a day bed and night bed, but he had his favorite cushions, he had his rubber rings, his breakfast bowl was different, lunch bowl and supper bowl. And he was realizing that my car would never hold all this stuff. I started to drive away. As I moved off, Mrs. Pumphrey, with a despairing cry, threw an armful of the little coats through the window. Now Dr. Herriot realized that his car could not hold all this stuff because this was too much for him to handle. So he thought that I would just run off. But Mrs. Pumphrey, she was with a despairing cry, she was, crying a lot, and she was not able to control her, sorrow, and she threw an armful of little coats through the window. I looked in the mirror. Before I turned the corner of the drive, everybody was in tears. Now, Dr. Herriot, as he took the dog out in his car, he saw that all the people were in tears, all the maids, all the servants, and Mrs. Pumphrey, she was in tears. She was not able to part with her dog. She even wanted him to carry all the things, all the luxuries that she used to give him. She wanted that they should also go along with Tricki, so that he always feels comfortable with Dr. Herriot. On the road, I glanced down at the pathetic little animal gasping on the seat by my side. I patted the head and Tricki made a brave effort to wag his tail. Poor old lad, I said, you haven't a kick in you, but I think I know a cure for you. Now he's out on the road. Dr. Herriot is finally out on the road. He's out of Mrs. Pumphrey's sight, and he glanced, he looked at the pathetic little animal. Pathetic little animal, here pathetic little animal refers to Tricki, who was sitting in the back side of his car. I patted the head. He patted his head, and Tricki, wagged his tail. He made a brave effort, because it was a brave effort, because he was not feeling well, he was so down, he was not doing anything. But it was a brave effort from his part to wag his tail. And he said, Dr. Herriot said to himself that he is such a poor old lad. You do not have a kick in you. You do not have a kick in you means you are not able to do anything. And you are so sick, but I know a cure for you. Yeah, Dr. Herriot was already having a cure for him, and he was actually very serious at this time. He is going to make Tricki well. How does he do that? We'll learn. At the surgery, the household dogs surged around me. Tricki looked down at the noisy pack with dull eyes, and when put down, lay motionless on the carpet. Now, at the surgery is the place where doctor, a dentist or a veterinary surgeon treats patient. Now, as I told you that whenever we hear about surgery, we think that surgery is an operation. But here surgery means that a place where they keep their patients. Generally a doctor or a dentist, they treat their patients. So it was a place, it was a nice cozy place where he used to keep all his patients, where he used to treat all his patients, and he saw all the household dogs surging around him. They had sort of made a circle around him. They were actually trying to, show their love towards Dr. Herriot. Tricki looked down at the noisy pack. The noisy pack, here the noisy pack refers to all the doctors, all the household doctors, with dull eyes and lay motionless on the carpet. Now, because he didn't have any energy, his eyes were dull and he was looking at the noisy pack, but obviously he was not very interested. So he lay motionless on the carpet. He was not even able to move. He had become so hugely fat, he was not able to move. The other dog, after sniffing around him for a few seconds, decided he was an uninteresting object and ignored him. The other dogs, like the other dogs do, what do the dogs do? Dogs sniff the other animal or the person in order to understand the people, or in order to understand the person or the animal. When we have to know someone, we try to talk to him. We talk to the person, we talk about their interests, their hobbies. But how do dogs come to know of each other? They sniff them. When they sniffed Tricki, they thought that he was an uninteresting object, because he was not doing anything, he was lying motionless, he was not responding. So that is why they thought it's an uninteresting object, and they totally ignored him and moved on. I made up a bed for him in a warm, loose box next to the one where the other's dog slept. For 2 days, I kept an eye on him, giving him no food but plenty of water. Now, what did Dr. Herriot do? He made up a bed in a warm, loose box next to the other dogs. He didn't keep him separately, okay? Although he saw that the other dogs are not taking interest in him, and neither is he taking interest in other dogs, still he made a bed next to the other dogs for 2 days. For 2 days he kept an eye on him. He was keeping an eye. He didn't give him any food, and he was giving him plenty of water. So this was a kind of experiment that he was doing. He didn't give him any food. He gave him a lot of fluid. At the end of second day, he started to show some interest in his surroundings, and on the third, he began to whimper when he heard the dogs in the yard. Now what happened at the second day? In the end of the second day, he was not getting any food, he was just getting water. So that was actually improving his condition. That is why he started noticing the things around him. You know how active the dogs are. Dogs always keep on looking what is around them. Now our poor Tricki also started, paying attention to the surroundings. And when the other dogs were playing, when the other dogs were in the yard, he started to whimper. Whimper here means making noises. Making small noises in pain. Because he was in pain, he used to make small, faintly noises. He was trying to do like that. And when I opened the door, Tricki trotted out and was immediately engulfed by Joey, the greyhound, and his friends. After rolling him over and thoroughly inspecting him, the dogs moved off down to the garden. Tricki followed them, rolling slightly with his surplus fat. When I opened the door, when Dr. Herriot opened the door, Tricki trotted out. Trotted out means he just moved out and he was immediately engulfed by joy. Now, actually, engulf means swallowing, but he didn't swallow Tricki. He actually, did like this. Okay, how do the dogs show their love, and affection? They just try to, they just hug the dog. They, roll pull him. They just roll him over, and they rolled him over and then they inspected him, they sniffed him all around. They inspected that everything is okay with him or not. And the dogs moved off to the garden. Then they went to the garden and Tricki followed them. Okay, this is the way dogs actually know each other, as I already told you. You can see it. You can see it in the parks or anywhere where the dogs live. They actually show their affection like this only. They are always, rolling the other dog. This is the way they actually play. This is the way they actually bond with each other. Now, rolling slightly with his surplus fat. Here it is important to see that he still had fat. Tricki still had fat when he went to play with the other dogs. Later that day, I was present at feeding time. I watched while Tristan slopped the food into the bowls. There was the usual head-along rush followed by the sounds of high-speed eating. Every dog knew that if he fell behind the others, he was liable to have some competition for the last part of his meal. Yeah, later that day, what happened? As expected, he was present at the feeding time and he was watching that while every dog was eating, and as expected, the dogs were eating their food very fast. Dogs actually, when there are a lot of dogs present and they are served food, all the dogs are in a bit of a competition. They start eating their food very fast, because they know that if a part of their food is left, when everybody is finished, they are going to have a competition. The other dogs are going to eat their food also. So that is why this thing was happening, and there was a lot of noise because they slurp the food. They don't actually eat food like this. They are slurping. So the constant sound of the tongues could be heard. Now every dog knew. Okay, what did Tricki do? What did Tricki do? When they had finished, Tricki took a walk around the shining bowls, licking casually inside one or two of them. Now the bowls were shining. The question comes, why were the bowls shining? Bowls were shining because the dogs had actually licked it clean. They had licked all the bowls clean. And what did Tricki do? Tricki sniffed around a little bit. He licked in one or the two bowls. Next day, an extra bowl was put out for him, and I was pleased to see him jostling his way towards it. Now, next day what happened? He was ready to have food. An extra bowl was kept for him, and he actually jostled. Jostle means, pushed his way around, pushed his way. When actually we are in a crowd, we have to, push and pull the other people to make our way. And this was the way. Tricki, he made his way and he went to his bowl and he started feeding. From then on, his progress was rapid. He had no medical treatment of any kind, but all day he ran about with the dogs, joining in their friendly scrimmages. From then on, obviously, when he started eating food again, Dr. Herriot was sure that now he's getting better. His progress was very rapid. He had no medicinal treatment. Yes, we can see, we have to see that there was no medicinal treatment. No medicines were given to Tricki. All day he ran around. All day he ran about with the other dogs. He used to join them with their friendly scrimmages. Scrimmages here means rough or confused struggle. The dogs are always, struggling with the other dogs. They are sort of playing with the other dogs. They are rolling them and they are, pouncing on them. He discovered the joys of being bowled over. Here it is written, it is explained very clearly. He was bowled over. He was trampled, he was squashed every few minutes. Bowled over means he was rolled like this. He was trampled. Trampled means a foot was put on him and he was trampled, and he was squashed. Squashed means he was squeezed. Squeezed so much. Squashed means squeezing in order to create pain, you know, in order to induce pain. But he was enjoying all these things. He was enjoying all these scrimmages with other dogs because this was the thing that was missing. This was the bond that was missing in his life. He became an accepted member of the gang, an unlikely, silky little object among the shaggy crew, fighting like a tiger for his share at meal times and hunting rats in the old hen house at night. Now, what is he being compared to? He is being compared to a silky little object. He was a silky little object. He was a brownish dog and his coat was always shining. Coat, not the coat he was wearing actually. The hair on his body, they were always shining because he was such a pampered dog. He was being cleaned every day and his hair were all shiny. And the other shaggy crew, but he made a bond with the shaggy crew. He had become an accepted part of the rough dogs. Shaggy crew means the rough dogs, the street kind of dogs, but he was an accepted member and he was fighting like a tiger at meal times. They are fighting like a tiger. He was also, you know, ready to, you know, he was not ready to part his meal. He was fighting. And hunting rats. He also used to hunt rats in the old hen house at night. At night, he used to go with other dogs to, you know, look for mice. He had never had such a time in his life. Never in his life he had such a time. So this thing that was missing from his life, he actually loved the bond, the bonding with other dogs. He used to love playing with other dogs. All the while, Mrs. Pumphrey hovered anxiously in the background, ringing a dozen times a day for the latest bulletins. All this while, now we are talking about Tricki, but what about poor Mrs. Pumphrey? Poor Mrs. Pumphrey was hovering. Hovering actually means flying in the air, actually following someone. Hovering like a bat, you can say. But what happened? Mrs. Pumphrey was ringing a dozen times. She was calling Mr. Herriot dozen times, 12 times a day to get the latest bulletins, to get the latest information on Tricki, whether he's, you know, improving or not, what's his condition, is he okay. I dodged the questions about whether his cushions were being turned regularly or his correct coat worn according to the weather, but I was able to tell her that the little fellow was out of danger and convulsing rapidly. Now, Mrs. Pumphrey was asking all sort of questions. That is his comfort being looked upon? Are his cushions turned? Are the covers changed? Or is he wearing the correct coat according to the weather? Because according to her, these are the comforts that actually help the dogs. So she was asking all sort of questions, but all these questions were very cleverly dodged by the doctor. Dodged means actually ignored. He ignored cleverly. He ignored all these questions when being asked, and he only said that the little fellow was out of danger. He was not in danger anymore, and he was convulsing rapidly. Convulsing here means recovering. He was recovering very well. He was getting out of danger very well. The word convulsing seemed to do something to Mrs. Pumphrey. Now Mrs. Pumphrey was a little bit of a satisfaction after hearing that her dog was recovering. And what happened? Mrs. Pumphrey, she started seemed to do something to Mrs. Pumphrey. Now, what does this mean? It means that when she heard that her dog was feeling well, it did something to her. She started bringing around fresh eggs, 2 dozen at a time, to build up Tricki's strength. For a happy period, my partners and I had 2 eggs each for breakfast. But when the bottles of wine began to arrive, the real possibilities of the situation began to dawn on the household. Now what happened? She started to bring around fresh eggs. As soon as she heard that the dog is completely out of danger, he's, improving, his condition is, he's recovering. So she thought he must be needing, healthy food. So she used to send fresh eggs, 2 dozen at a time, to build up Tricki's strength, to build up his strength for a happy period. For a happy period means the period for which Tricki's, stayed. His partners, whose partners? Dr. Herriot and his partners were having the time of the day. They used to have 2 eggs in the morning because 2 dozen eggs were coming and all the partners used to share the eggs with each other. But when the bottles of wine began to come, he actually saw the real possibility of the situation, that if we keep Tricki for long, we are going to enjoy all these things. Yeah, yes, they were actually having the time of their life. They were getting eggs for free, they were getting wine for free, and they were actually, seeing that yes, it's a profitable business to keep Tricki with them. It was to enrich Tricki's blood. Lunch became a ceremonial occasion with 2 glasses of wine before and several during the meal. We could hardly believe it when the brandy came to put a final edge on Tricki's constitution. For a few nights, the fine spirit was rolled around, inhaled, and reverently drunk. Now, it was to enrich Tricki's blood. In order to enrich Tricki's blood, Mrs. Pumphrey used to send some wine, because wine is, considered to be a very healthy thing. If you drink wine, it is said that it purifies your blood. So she was doing that. Now lunch became a ceremonial occasion. It was like a ceremony. It was like a festival. It was like an occasion. They were enjoying 2 glasses of wine before and several, during the meal. They were having it before the meal. They were having with the meal. They were enjoying the, bottles of wine that were coming. We could hardly believe. They didn't believe when brandy came to the constitution. It means that brandy, she was also sending brandy so that it could be drunk by Tricki and he could, feel well. But they were really enjoying that. For a few nights, the fine spirit. Here the fine spirit means the brandy that they were having. He said that he was rolled. It was rolled, it was sniffed, and it was, taken reverently. Here reverently means with respect. They used to drink it with respect in order to pay respect to Mrs. Pumphrey, because Mrs. Pumphrey was actually sending all these things for Tricki. But because they were enjoying it, so they said that we used to, sit and enjoy it. We used to sit and enjoy each and every sip of it. We used to have wine, we used to have brandy, and we had a lot of respect for Mrs. Pumphrey, who used to send it for, not for them, but for Tricki. There were days of deep content, starting well with the extra egg in the morning, improved and sustained by the midday wine, and finishing luxuriously around the fire with brandy. Now they're actually explaining their fortnight, the 2 weeks that Tricki spent there. How was their life? They were having an extra egg in the morning. The midday was sustained with a glass of wine. They were having a glass of wine in the afternoon, and in the night they finished this luxurious, day with a brandy. So we can see that how cleverly Dr. Herriot is making full use of the things that Mrs. Pumphrey was sending for Tricki. It was a temptation to keep Tricki on as a permanent guest, but I knew Mrs. Pumphrey was suffering, and after a fortnight felt compelled to phone and tell her that little dog had recovered and was awaiting collection. Now it was a temptation. It was really a temptation. He was very happy to keep Tricki. Because of Tricki, they were enjoying all the luxuries of, wine and brandy and extra eggs. But he knew that Mrs. Pumphrey was actually suffering. Mrs. Pumphrey couldn't live without his dog, without her dog. That is why after fortnight, after 2 weeks, when he had, completely recovered well, he called Mrs. Pumphrey. He was actually compelled to call Mrs. Pumphrey out of duty, because as a doctor, it was his duty not only to take care of Tricki, but also her mistress, also her, owner. He called her and he said that you can come and collect Tricki. Within minutes, about 30 feet of gleaming black metal drew up outside the surgery. The chauffeur opened the door, and I could just make out of the figure of Mrs. Pumphrey, almost lost in the interior. Within minutes, just after the minutes. It means Mrs. Pumphrey was actually waiting. She didn't take long. She just hurriedly came. and 30 feet of gleaming black metal. It is referred to the car she came in. It was a black car of 30 feet. It was a luxurious car. She drew up outside. She came outside, and the chauffeur means the driver. The driver opened the door for her. She, came out, and he could see from far that Mrs. Pumphrey came out, and she was lost in the interior because she came there for the first time. She couldn't, find anyone, and she was lost in the interior. She couldn't find anyone. Her hands were tightly clasped in front of her. Her lips trembled. Oh, Mr. Herriot, do tell me the truth. Is he really better now? What was the condition of Mrs. Pumphrey? Mrs. Pumphrey was very desperate to see her dog, to see her dog's condition. She was like this. Oh, Mr. Herriot, please tell me, is he really well? Is he really well? Is he out of danger? Yes, he is fine. There is no need for you to get out of the car. I'll go and fetch him. Now, Dr. Herriot says, it's fine. He is, you do not need to get out of the car. You keep sitting in the car. I'll bring him for you. I walked through the house into the garden. A mass of dogs was hurling around and round the lawn, and in their midst, ears flapping, tail waving, was the little golden figure of Tricki. Now, what happened when he went to the garden? A mass of dogs. There were a lot of dogs, and between all those dogs was Tricki. And here the condition of Tricki has been explained. Okay, Tricki's condition. How was Tricki's condition? His ears were flapping, his tail was waving, and there was a little golden figure. His little golden figure, he was enjoying with the other dogs. Now, why is it explained? It is explained because it is being told that now Tricki is absolutely fine. He is lean again. He is not fat at all, and he is playing. He is enjoying with the other dogs. It means that he is perfectly okay. In 2 weeks, he had been transformed into a lithe, hard muscled animal. He was keeping up well with the pack, stretching out in the great bounds, his chest almost brushing up the ground. What was his transformation? How did he transform? He transformed into a lithe. Lithe means flexible, hard muscle dog. His muscles had become strong because he was doing so much exercise. He was transformed. His chest bulged out so much that it was actually touching the ground. His chest had, bloated up and stretched out. It had so much, and it means that he had become very flexible. He had become like the dogs usually should be, and he was perfectly in line. I carried him back along the passage to the front of the house. The chauffeur was still holding the car door open when Tricki saw his mistress. He took off from my arms in a tremendous leap and sailed into Mrs. Pumphrey's lap. Now, he is trying to explain what happens in the last. What happens when Mrs. Pumphrey and Tricki meet. I carried him back. He carried him back along the passage, and he took her, Tricki, to the car, and he could see that the driver was opening the door of the car like they usually do, and Mrs. Pumphrey was sitting, and Tricki came. What did he do? He jumped. He took a tremendous leap. He took a tremendous jump, and he sailed to Mrs. Pumphrey's lap. He landed in Mrs. Pumphrey's lap. She gave a startled, oh! She was startled because it was such a big jump, and he, sat into Mrs. Pumphrey's lap, but she was startled. She said, oh! And then had to defend herself as he swarmed over her, licking her face and barking. Now she actually had to defend herself because she was actually startled. He was licking her. He was, all swarmed over her. He was barking. He was actually showing his excitement after meeting Mrs. Pumphrey. During this excitement, I helped the chauffeur to bring out the beds, toys, cushions, coats and bowls, none of which had been used. Now, the main thing comes that none of the things that Mrs. Pumphrey sent along with Tricki were used because Tricki was actually not giving any of the comforts that he used to get inside his house. As the car moved away, Mrs. Pumphrey leaned out of the window. Tears shone in her eyes. Her lips trembled. Oh, Mr. Herriot, she cried. How can I ever thank you? This is a triumph of surgery. Now Mrs. Pumphrey leaned out of the window. She, put her head out of the window and she thanked Mr. Herriot. She said her tears shone in her eyes. They were shining in her eyes, and she said, "Oh, Mr. Herriot," she started crying. She said, "This is a triumph of surgery." Yes, here the name of the chapter comes. It was a triumph of a surgery because Dr. Herriot was actually successful in bringing Tricki out of the danger. Now, what we had expected actually, we had expected that when Tricki was actually enjoying inside the surgery, he was enjoying with other dogs, maybe he won't go to Mrs. Pumphrey. He won't be happy to Mrs. Pumphrey because he wanted to stay with the other dogs. But we also know that dogs are very loyal. Why do people love dogs so much? Because dogs are very loyal. The moment Mrs. Pumphrey came, he forgot every comfort. He forgot not the comfort, he actually forgot all the playfulness. He forgot that he was enjoying so much inside the surgery. He went again to Mrs. Pumphrey, he hugged her, he licked her, and he started barking, and he showed all his affection to Mrs. Pumphrey. He didn't forget Mrs. Pumphrey, and he started showing his affection again to Mrs. Pumphrey. And this is the thing which is actually expected from the dogs, and that is true loyalty. Now, characters. Yeah, we are going to talk about the characters. Mrs. Pumphrey. Who's Mrs. Pumphrey? Mrs. Pumphrey, if we have to explain her, she was a fabulously rich and resourceful woman who loved her pet dog dearly. Yeah, she loves her pet dog dearly. She's a very rich woman. She's very worried about her dog's miserable condition as he has become hugely fat, and therefore he has become lethargic. Now, she was quite worried about her dog's condition. She loved her dog so much. She loved her dog unconditionally. She seeks the help of Dr. Herriot. Now, she seeks the help of Dr. Herriot. When Dr. Herriot takes Tricki away to his clinic, she leaves no stone unturned to provide her dog with all the comfort there. She arranges cushions, toys, bed, and food for Tricki. This shows that she is impractical yet very caring and compassionate towards her dog. Now, what do we come to know about her character? That she is impractical. She is actually impractical because she doesn't know that what actually a dog needs. He doesn't need cushions. He doesn't need, extra toys and beds and bowls. He needs affection. He needs love of other dogs. So she didn't know that, but she was very caring. She used to care for him a lot, and she was actually very compassionate towards her dog. She was very, passionate towards helping her dog, towards providing each and everything that was possible for Tricki. Tricki, who was Tricki? Tricki was more than a pet dog for Mrs. Pumphrey. Yes, he was more than a dog. He was a pampered child of her. He was a pampered child. He was a spoiled brat of Mrs. Pumphrey. Tricki, he was a small dog. His only fault was that he never refused food. His only fault was that he loved food. He was very greedy for food and always overfed on sweets, cakes, and chocolates. This made him hugely fat. He loved chocolates so much that he became hugely fat. His eyes became bloodshot and rheumy. Yes, they were bloodshot and rheumy. They were filled with, watery discharge. He was always listless and lethargic. He was always listless. He couldn't do anything. He was always, lying around like that only. He was motionless. He couldn't do anything. Despite all this, he recovered surprisingly well. Now, the best thing about Tricki was that he recovered. He recovered completely. He responded to the treatment very well, and he transformed into a flexible and hard muscle dog. He actually completely transformed into a flexible and hard muscled dog. Dr. James Herriot. Dr. Herriot was a compassionate doctor who loved his patients. He was really worried about Tricki and wanted to treat him. Now, what kind of a person was Dr. Herriot? Dr. Herriot was a compassionate doctor who loved his patients a lot. He was very much, worried about Tricki, and he wanted to treat him. He understood that Tricki's only fault was no refusal for food. It means that he was very understanding. It means that he had diagnosed his problem quite well. It also shows that he is an excellent doctor. He gave him no medicinal treatment. He gave him no medicinal treatment. He gave him no food, but plenty of fluids. He gave him a lot of exercise. This worked amazingly well. Yes, this worked amazingly well. He responded very well. Tricki responded very well, and he transformed into a flexible and hard muscle dog. And one thing more, the best thing about Dr. Herriot is that he was clever enough to keep Tricki on a strict diet and enjoyed the eggs, brandy and wine that came for Tricki himself. Now Dr. Herriot was a lovely person. And he was also very clever. He didn't refuse Mrs. Pumphrey. When Mrs. Pumphrey used to send everything, he didn't, dishearten Mrs. Pumphrey. He didn't hurt Mrs. Pumphrey by saying that no need for all these things. I am going to treat him on my own. I am going to treat him in my way. Instead, he kept everything. This made Mrs. Pumphrey happy. And he didn't give anything to Tricki. Tricki was also happy. Tricki was also recovering well. And he used to consume all these things himself, and along with his partners. So he kept everything. He used to, it was a win-win situation for all. Actually, we can say it was a win-win situation for all. Everybody was happy. Everybody was hale and hearty at the end. Now, the summary of the chapter. Mrs. Pumphrey was a rich and emotional lady who has a cute pet. It was a small dog. She named it Tricki. She loved him so much that she usually overfed him. So we can see that she was a rich and emotional lady. She, kept her dog's name Tricki, and she loved him so much, and he had put on a lot of weight. Because of this, he had put on a lot of weight, which made him slow and pathetic. When Dr. James Herriot saw the fat dog like a bloated sausage, he was really shocked. Yes, when he saw Tricki like a bloated sausage, Dr. Herriot was actually in a state of shock. He made a plan and told Mrs. Pumphrey that Tricki needed treatment for a disease which was possible only in hospital. Now, as Dr. Herriot was very ready, he was ready to treat him. He told Mrs. Pumphrey that he needed treatment. That is why I have to hospitalize him for a fortnight. I'll keep him along with me. The doctor knew that Mrs. Pumphrey would not be able to keep the dog on a proper diet. When the greedy dog went to the hospital, he had to remain hungry. If he was slow to approach for food, he was made, towards food. He was not given food instantly. He was kept on a strict diet for 2 days. He was not given food. He was given plenty of fluids instead. He was given food at fixed intervals. Soon he shed off a lot of his body weight and became quite active. So we see that he knew that Mrs. Pumphrey cannot keep him on diet. That is why he took him along and used to give him food on regular intervals. When Tricki was at home, he was pampered by Mrs. Pumphrey. He had a luxurious life when he was served with cream cake, chocolate and Horlicks. But when he came to the doctor, he became all right. Now, what happened when Tricki was at home? He was being pampered a lot. He was given cream cakes and chocolates. All of those things are quite high on calories. Now, he was given Horlicks and malt. But with Dr. Herriot, when he went to the doctor, he became all right. He shed off a lot of weight. He actually became very fit. He transformed into, a very active dog. When Mrs. Pumphrey saw her active dog, she thanked the doctor and felt that it was a triumph of surgery. So finally, when Mrs. Pumphrey saw her active dog, she saw that he had completely transformed, and she thanked Dr. Herriot and said that it was a triumph of surgery, which brings us to the title of this chapter. Now, we'll move on to question answers, which are very important in lieu of the exams. They are very important. Why was Dr. Herriot shocked at Tricki's appearance? Dr. Herriot was shocked at Tricki's appearance because he had become hugely fat. His eyes looked bloodshot and roomy, and his tongue lolled from his jaws. He could walk with difficulties. Now we have to explain the appearance of Tricki, because the appearance of Tricki was so pathetic. That is why Dr. Herriot was shocked. What did Mrs. Pumphrey do to bring him back to normal health? Was she successful? Now they're asking a question that was Mrs. Pumphrey able to bring him to the normal life, and was she successful? When Mrs. Pumphrey found Tricki was weak, she thought he was malnutritioned. She started giving him extra diet between meals. She gave him malt, cod liver oil, and a bowl of Horlicks at night. When Mrs. Pumphrey saw Tricki that he was listless, he was not doing anything, he was very weak, she started giving him extra diet between meals. She started giving him malt, cod liver oil, and a bowl of Horlicks. All the things very, high on calories. She even gave him cream cakes and chocolate cakes, which Tricki really loved. No, she was not successful. Obviously, she was not successful. Rather, she put her dog in more trouble. He started gaining weight, which made his condition worse. So, the unconditional love of Mrs. Pumphrey, the extra large love she showed for Tricki, made Tricki sick. What kind of treatment was given to Tricki? Did it help in his recovery? Tricki was given a non-medicinal treatment. What kind of treatment he was given? He was given a non-medicinal treatment. His diet regime was altered depending upon his body's response to it. It was altered. Oh no, okay. First, Dr. Herriot, it was like an experiment. Dr. Herriot actually saw that if we didn't give him any food and we only keep him on a fluid diet, if we only keep him on liquid diet, how is his body going to respond? He was actually under the observation phase. He was kept on liquid diet for the first 2 days, and then his diet was gradually increased. Yes, this treatment did help Tricki as it built up his energy. He transformed to an energetic, hard muscle dog in just a fortnight. In just a matter of 2 weeks, he was transformed to a hard muscled, lithe dog, because this treatment actually helped him. This observational experiment kind of treatment helped Tricki. Was Tricki suffering from any ailment in reality? If not, then what made him inactive and lethargic? Was he suffering from a disease? And what made him lethargic? No, Tricki was not suffering from any ailment. It was his greed for food and the love of his mistress that spoiled his health to such an extent. He was being overfed every day, and that made him obese and lethargic. That is why his health showed a rapid improvement when his diet was controlled. Yes, Tricki was not suffering from any disease. He was not suffering from any ailment. His only problem was greed for food, and her mistress was actually overfeeding him. She was giving him everything in extra quantity, and that had, made him so lethargic. And that is why his health showed a rapid improvement. When all these things were stopped, his health actually started showing improvement. Why did Mrs. Pumphrey call the doctor? Why did Mrs. Pumphrey call the doctor? Tricki was not eating anything from the past few days. He had refused even his favorite dishes and had bouts of vomiting. He was spending his time lying on a rug panting. He was not going for walks. All these symptoms forced Mrs. Pumphrey to call the doctor. Yes, what was Tricki actually? What happened to Tricki? What was the final straw that made Mrs. Pumphrey call Dr. Herriot? Now, Tricki was not eating anything. His body was not responding well. He refused his food. We know that Tricki never refused food, but he was refusing food. This, it made sure that he was not feeling well, and he was also puking a lot. He was spending his time lying motionless on the carpet, and he used to pant, and he was not going for walks. All these symptoms forced Mrs. Pumphrey to call the doctor, but we know that everything ended so well, like our chapter. Yes, our chapter also has ended on a very positive note, that we should not love the other person or the animal so much that we, actually spoil the person, we spoil the health of that particular person. So the extra love is also not so great, okay? In a few cases, we should not overfeed the animals, especially because their bodies do not respond very well to that. Okay, thank you for this amazing session. We'll meet in the next class surely. Okay, bye-bye, take care.